The pedagogy of intertextuality. Intertextuality is not new. It may remind some of Eliot's notion of tradition, though the parameters are certainly broader. It is an important concept, though it counters what I see as one prevailing composition pedagogy, one favoring a romantic image of the writer, offering as role models the creative essayist, the Sunday supplement freelancers, the Joan Didions, E.B. Whites, Calvin Trillans, and Russell Bakers. This dashing image appeals to our need for intellectual heroes, but underlying it may be an anti-rhetorical view that writers are born, not made, that writing is individual, isolated, and internal, not social, but eccentric. This view is firmly set in the intertext of our discipline. Our anthologies glorify the individual essayist whose work is valued for its timelessness and creativity. Freshman rhetorics announce as the writer's proper goals personal insight, originality, and personal voice, or tell students that motivations for writing come from within. Generally, this pedagogy assumes that such a thing as the writer actually exists, an autonomous writer exercising a free creative will through the writing act, and that the writing process proceeds linearly from writer to text to reader. This partial picture of the process can all too readily become the picture, and our students can all too readily learn to overlook the vital facets of discourse production. When we romanticize composition by overemphasizing the autonomy of the writer, important questions are overlooked, the same questions an intertextual view of writing would provoke. To what extent is the writer's product itself a part of a larger community writing process? How does the discourse community influence writers and readers within it? These are essential questions, but are perhaps outside the prevailing episteme of composition pedagogy, which presupposes the autonomous status of the writer as independent cogito. Cogito means in Latin I think that Descartes presented. I think, therefore I am. Talking about writing in terms of social forces influencing the writer raises the specter of determinism, and so is anathema. David Bartholomew summarizes this issue very nicely. The struggle of the student writer is not the struggle to bring out that which is within. It is the struggle to carry out those ritual activities that grant our entrance into a closed society. When we teach writing only as the act of bringing out what is within, we risk undermining our own efforts. Intertextuality reminds us that carrying out ritual activities is also part of the writing process. Barth reminds us that the I, which approaches the text, is already itself a plurality of other texts, of codes, which are infinite. Intertextuality suggests that our goal should be to help students learn to write for the discourse communities they choose to join. Students need help developing out of what Joseph Williams calls their pre-socialized cognitive states. According to Williams, pre-socialized writers are not sufficiently immersed in their discourse community to produce competent discourse. They do not know what can be presupposed, are not conscious of the distinctive intertextuality of the community, may be only superficially acquainted with explicit conventions. Williams cites the example of the freshman whose paper for the English teacher begins, "Shakespeare is a famous Elizabethan dramatist." Our immediate goal is to produce socialized writers who are full-fledged members of their discourse community, producing competent, useful discourse within that community. Our long-range goal might be post-socialized writers, those who have achieved such a degree of confidence, authority, power, or achievement in the discourse community so as to become part of the regulating body. They are able to vary conventions and question assumptions, that is, affect change in communities without fear of exclusion. Intertextuality has the potential to affect all facets of our composition pedagogy. Certainly, it supports writing across the curriculum as a mechanism for introducing students to the regulating systems of discourse communities. It raises questions about heuristics. Do different discourse communities apply different heuristics? It asserts the value of critical reading in the composition classroom. It requires that we rethink our ideas about plagiarism. Certainly, imitatio is an important stage in the linguistic development of the writer. The most significant application might be in the area of audience analysis. Current pedagogies assume that when writers analyze audiences, they should focus on the expected flesh and blood readers. Intertextuality suggests that the proper focus of audience analysis is not the audience as receivers per se, but the intertext of the discourse community. Instead of collecting demographic data about age, educational level, and social status, the writer might instead ask questions about the intertext. What are the conventional presuppositions of this community? In what forums do they assemble? What are the methodological assumptions? What is considered evidence, valid argument, and proof? A sample heuristic for such an analysis, what I term forum analysis, is included as an appendix. A critical reading of the discourse of a community may be the best way to understand it. We see a version of this message in the advice to examine a journal before submitting articles for publication. Traditionally, anthologies have provided students with reading material. However, the typical anthologies have two serious problems. One, limited range. Generally, they overemphasize literary or expressive discourse. Two, unclear context. They frequently remove readings from their original context, thus disguising their intertextual nature. Several recently published readers have attempted to provide a broader selection of readings in various forums and actually discuss intertextuality. Maimon's Readings in the Arts and Sciences, Canavy's Writing in the Liberal Arts Tradition, and Bazerman's The Informed Writer are especially noteworthy. Writing assignments should be explicitly intertextual if we regard each written product as a stage in a larger process, the dialectic process within a discourse community. Then the individual writer's work is part of a web, part of a community search for truth and meaning. Writing assignments might take the form of dialogue with other writers. Writers writing letters in response to articles is one kind of dialectic. For example, letters responding to Atlantic Monthly or science articles. Research assignments might be more community-oriented rather than topic-oriented. Students might be asked to become involved in communities of researchers. For example, the sociologists examining changing religious attitudes in American college students. The assignments in Maimon's Writing in the Arts and Sciences are excellent in this regard. Intertextual theory suggests that the key criteria for evaluating writing should be acceptability within some discourse community. Acceptability includes, but goes well beyond, adherence to formal conventions. It includes choosing the right topic, applying the appropriate critical methodology, adhering to standards for evidence and validity, and in general adopting the community's discourse values. And of course, borrowing the appropriate traces. Success is measured by the writer's ability to know what can be presupposed and to borrow that community's traces effectively to create a text that contributes to the maintenance or possibly the definition of the community. The writer is constrained by the community and by its intertextual preferences and prejudices, but the effective writer works to assert the will against those community constraints to effect change. The Pepsi commercial and the Kent State News articles show effective uses of the intertext. In the Kent State piece, John Kiffner mixes picnic imagery, grassy campus gathering spot, young people, with violent imagery, burst of gunfire, to dramatize the event. The Pepsi ad writers combine two unlikely sets of traces, linking folksy Depression-era American imagery with sci-fi imagery, stolen from Spielberg. For this creative intertwining of traces, both discourses can probably be measured successful in their respective forums. Coda. Clearly, much of what intertextuality supports is already institutionalized. For example, writing across the curriculum programs. And yet, in freshman comp texts, and anthologies especially, there is this tendency to see writing as individual, as isolated, as heroic. Even after demonstrating quite convincingly that the declaration was written by a team freely borrowing from the cultural intertext, Elaine Maimon insists, against all the evidence she herself has collected, that despite the additions, deletions, and changes in wording that it went through, the Declaration is still Jefferson's writing. Her saying this presupposes that the reader has just concluded the opposite. When we give our students romantic role models like E.B. White, Joan Didion, and Lewis Thomas, we create unrealistic expectations. This type of writer has often achieved post-socialized status within some discourse community. Thomas in the scientific community, for instance. We can realistically expect, or can we realistically expect our students to achieve this state without first becoming socialized, without learning first what it means to write within a social context? Their role models ought not to be only romantic heroes, but also community writers like Jefferson, the anonymous writers of the Pepsi commercial, the Adzos of the world, not just the Aristotles. They need to see writers whose products are more evidently part of a larger process and whose work more clearly produces meaning in social contexts.